What makes factions the ultimate D&D tool? Because without them, your D&D game, kinda boring. Players stop caring, the world feels empty. It's kind of like running a theme park with no rides. Which is like, technically probably still better than what I used to do with Rollercoaster Tycoon. But look, at my table, if my players aren't constantly arguing about who they should trust or whether or not it might be worth it to kind of throw the tavern barkeep to the wolves, then I know I'm kind of off my game. Because factions are one of the best ways to keep the tension in your games alive. And here's the truth. A lot of DMs tend to use factions completely wrong. And that's how their world ends up feeling a little bit flat. But today, we're gonna break down those big mistakes that some DMs tend to make. And then I'll show you 5 ways to turn factions into little baby drama machines. That way, every single one of your sessions feels like an episode of Game of Thrones. But you know, from like one of the good seasons. So the very first thing a lot of DMs get wrong is that they add factions in after they've already finished world building. Kind of like the way some people treat flavor in their cooking. You know, like a thieves guild is just a little bit of dried stale parsley that they've decided to sprinkle on top. Optional. An afterthought. Factions, though, they shape the entire flavor of your world. Much more so than having a town off to the side of the map that no one will ever reach. So after I figure out what I want my campaign's high concept to be, so for example a Feywild version of Under the Dome, one of the very next things I do is I start thinking about who is influencing life here and how are they influencing it, for better or for worse. Because here's the thing, the second you know who's driving change in your world, you also know who's likely to react when Cindy's going around being a murder hobo again. It's the difference between a static setting and one that pushes back. So that's a great place to invest your world building efforts into. Another big mistake, factions that are too passive or too generic, and by proxy, completely forgettable. It's easy to just lay something out like, here's the good guys that the players should side with, and here's the big evil empire that they're supposed to fight. And if it isn't your first campaign, that's a complete snooze fest. Players crave nuance. They want to make hard choices. They want moral gray areas. They want to decide who the real baddies are themselves. So going back to my Feywild campaign, I'd want a second to think beyond that black and white worldview. What kind of factions appear in situations where people are trapped together in a small town like this? And how would that be altered by this Fey-inspired setting? One faction might be trying to seize control of the town by force. Another faction might be focused on gathering knowledge about the Fae, and they might want more careful, deliberate decisions. And a religious faction might even be a wild card. They might be secretly letting the Fae into the dome. Maybe they think they're saviors instead of dangers. Notice how, though, none of them are just sitting on the sidelines. They're all actively pushing towards something, which means that conflict is inevitable. These are the types of factions that create tons of different types of plot hooks for your games. More on that in a bit, though. Because before we go over the 5 things that make a faction truly memorable, the last thing I see a lot of DMs get wrong is kind of subtle, but I've seen it sour more than a few campaigns. And that's letting your feelings get hurt by your players ignoring your factions. Maybe you've built up this entire royal political court intrigue, but your players have all just decided to get on a ship to become pirates. This can happen for so many different reasons. And I really recommend watching my Campaign Building 101 series if you haven't already. It'll definitely help make sure you don't end up with a weird situation where the players are showing up for a completely different game than the one you happen to be running. But if your players seem to reject something like this, something that you've set up, I've got a great secret for you. Factions aren't tied to themes. They're tied to conflicts. Nothing is stopping you from repackaging your work with some hook hands and shoulder parrots. That way they appeal more to your players and the things that they're excited about in your world. Don't fall into the trap of thinking that you can only use these factions one way, because these factions are ultimately just templates for plot hooks and conflicts. So if you stay flexible, your players will always find their way back towards the fun. So if these are the mistakes that make factions boring, what can we do to make sure that our players are enchanted by our beguilingly crafted factions instead. Start by giving your factions purpose. What do I mean by this? Factions aren't just big ol' groups of NPCs. They should exist for a reason. They're there to push on the world in ways that your players can't simply control or ignore. So ask yourself, why does this faction exist? Are they enforcing order, protecting their trade, trying to convert lost souls? Because if they don't have a clear reason to exist, they're ultimately just set dressing. I tend to think of factions as occupying three sorts of general spheres. We have government, business and civilians, and then religion. So when you're creating a faction, think about what sorts of conflicts might be introduced between these different factions. What happens when these spheres collide? Like, imagine a government faction trying to lay down strict laws, and a merchant's guild trying to bend these laws for profit. Who wins? Who loses? That's where you'll have a chance to wrap your players up into the drama. Because remember, factions aren't just waiting around, waiting for your players to notice them. They should already be moving, acting, stirring things up in the background, whether your players choose to engage or not. So don't throw in a Thieves Guild faction just because you think every fantasy world needs one. If you do end up needing one, you can always add one in on the fly and flesh it out later. But only create factions that are actually doing something. Because factions that actively participate in and affect your worlds, they give your campaigns a beating heart. But of course, a purpose isn't enough on its own. The next question is, what exactly do these factions want? Which is why you need to give your factions specificity. Factions with vague goals are like players who say, I attack, with literally no description. Technically fine, but boring. God, so boring. Something like gaining power, not a good goal. Something like overthrow the king and put Frederick on the throne instead, better. Murder the king during the celebration of the return of the Moonbearers, imprison his son, and put Frederick on the throne in his place to serve as a puppet to the brains and the faction leader behind this operation, Lysander. Best. Here's the secret. The more specific the goal, the more ways that your players can collide with it. Do they try to foil the assassination? Do they plot with another faction to free the son that's been imprisoned? Do they end up siding with Lysander because, let's be honest, the king does kinda suck. You don't need to have everything mapped and planned out, but an easy gut check when it comes to trying to figure out if you're being specific enough is to ask yourself, what happens if the players never show up? If you feel a little lost on the details when you do this, your factions probably need more specific goals. Don't settle for vague, fuzzy goals. Give your factions something big and concrete. That way the world isn't waiting around for the party to come along and act. Give your players something that's moving around them instead, and creating more interesting ways for them to get involved than stopping Lysander from gaining power ever could. And if you're looking for some great specific factions you can drop right into your games, let me save you some time. Today's sponsor is Scorched Basin by Homie and the Dude, a Mad Max meets Dune-inspired TTRPG setting that is absolutely packed with 5 unique factions, each with their own values, goals, and agendas, and a massive, mysterious crystal monolith in the middle of a meteor crater. It's basically a faction playground. There are over 100 creators that got together to collaborate in various ways on this project. I actually got to voice one of the Skara Warrior NPCs. But Scorched Basin is not only jam-packed with cool lore. They've got a one-of-a-kind spell system called The Current, rules for vehicular madness for those who wish to be shiny and chrome, tons of cool monsters inspired by your favorite desert fiction, a custom soundtrack for your sessions, and they even have recipes designed by a world-class chef. Like, as a maximalist, I am so into this. Who does that? But the best part? It's completely system agnostic. So whether you're playing 5e, 2024, Shadow Dark, Dagger Heart, Morkborg, or Franken games like lil ol' me, you can run either a full Scorched Basin campaign or just rip out pieces of lore and drop them straight into your already existing world. So if you're like me and love post-apocalyptic mayhem and fantasy desert aesthetics, support me and this awesome team by checking out Scorched Basin on Kickstarter using my link below. Now, Even if your factions have purpose and specific goals, there's still one trap that can make them feel a little flat. And that's when every member of the faction acts like a clone. And that's where variance comes in. The beauty of factions is that you don't need to flesh out a bunch of NPCs. You can improvise the majority of them on the fly. But for your major factions, I like to build out a small handful of NPCs with different takes on the same big goal. That way the factions have some depth. I always flesh out a faction leader of some sort, someone who really embraces the faction's main goal, but then I like to add in 1 or 2 NPCs that are more of dissenters or rivals within this group. They should still share the same overall goal, but instead they'll have very different ideas about how they might achieve said goal. For example, everyone in this faction might agree that, yeah, the king has to go. Time to overthrow him. But NPC A might think that Lysander's an asshole and that he himself should be the next king. NPC B has no horse in that game, but is dead set on the idea that they should scrap imprisoning the sun and wipe out the entire royal line before anyone can hit them back. Suddenly your faction's no longer a weird hive mind monolith, but its own entity full of political drama waiting to pop off. And the reason I like to create these mini differences is because it gives the players options. Maybe they agree that Lysander is in fact a huge jerk. They would never support his cause. But NPC A is prone to flattery, so they might be willing to see how his bid for the throne works out. Maybe they think they can influence him. So choose a couple NPCs, jot down a quick sentence or 2 about why they have this big goal, what their other separate goals might be, and things like their rank, ability, resources, that sort of thing. This way, if you need to create someone in a faction on the fly, you still have your faction blueprint, but you've also fleshed out a handful of specific people in depth to give this faction a ton more life. And this is actually where most factions fall apart. At this point, they look great on paper, but in play, nothing happens. So let's fix that. Your factions need importance. This is about impact and consequences. I touched on this a little bit with specificity and purpose, but it deserves its own point because I really want to hammer this idea home. When your players interact with a faction, it should matter. Their choices should create ripples. Good ones, bad ones, even straight up weird ones. So ask yourself, why would this faction care about the party? Why would the PCs want to engage with them? What are the actual stakes at risk here? Do the players or the faction need resources, information, assistance? Or is the faction reacting to something the players already stirred up? Again, we don't want to just shoehorn these in just to have factions. Think about what would put them in the PC's path. And a great example of this is in Curse of Strahd. When the players first walk into the town of Valaki, one of the first things they notice in the town square is that there are people in the stocks wearing donkey masks. It's striking, it's unsettling, but most importantly, it's hard to ignore. Suddenly, the players know that this town has rules, punishments, power struggles, and depending on how they respond to everything, the story changes. So that's a great example of a faction being put in the player's path that's both lore-rich and actionable. And it can have long-lasting consequences or impact depending on what the players do. Because each faction cares about their own specific things, just like the players. They're moving within and altering the world, but they're also reacting to the presence of your players. Factions can push back. And remember, players can't be friends with everyone. If they cozy up to one group, they're probably burning a bridge with another, whether they intend to or not. All of these consequences, though, that's where our drama in these games lives. So once your factions have purpose, specificity, variety, and importance, how do we make absolutely sure that your players engage with them? Simple. Give the players a faction of their own. If you watched my Campaign Building 101 series, you'll know this is very much my pattern. Screw the tired you all meet in a tavern trope. I start every session 0 with the group already being part of something. That way they've got buy-in from their very first dice roll. So for my Feywild campaign, the group started as members of the Bramble Brigade, a scrappy town watch type of crew, and they were pitted against the forceful nature of the Baron's town guard. And then for my Underdark campaign, the group is united under the patronage of Boris, an eccentric retired explorer chasing after rumors of a magic crystal. But of course, so are his rivals. The point is, when the players start inside a faction of their own, they already have stakes, potential enemies, potential allies. It makes it easy for group dynamics to quickly and naturally emerge, and then suddenly the world around them feels just so very alive. And like, low-key, everything is a faction. You don't have to be super official with this. If all your PCs share a house and they all hate their obnoxious and noisy neighbors, congrats, they're part of a faction. Yay! If you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to like and subscribe. And now, if you're on mobile, don't forget to hype. That way YouTube knows you actually like my video. Yes, that's what we're doing now. And if you want even more DM tools to supercharge your campaigns, make sure to check out these bad boys next.